August 12, 1944. Willow Run Bomber Plant, Michigan. The sound arrived before comprehension, a mechanical symphony of such scale and complexity that Obergefreiter Ernst Hoffmann could only stand motionless behind the chain-link fence, watching an aluminum river flow through the assembly hall. Every 63 minutes, a complete B-24 Liberator heavy bomber rolled off the production line at Willow Run, a facility so vast that its main assembly building stretched over a mile in length and employed 42,000 workers operating in shifts that never stopped, a continuous industrial heartbeat that transformed raw materials into four-engine bombers, at rates that violated every assumption Hoffmann had held about what was industrially possible. The sound was not a single noise but a layered acoustic landscape. The pneumatic hiss of rivet guns, the metallic clang of aluminum sheets being positioned, the electric whir of overhead cranes moving components with balletic precision, and beneath it all, the low-frequency hum of electrical systems powering machinery whose collective consumption exceeded that of entire German cities. Hoffmann pressed his face close to the fence, his breath forming small clouds of condensation on the wire mesh despite the August heat. Watching American workers, men and women, young and old, representing a cross-section of a civilian population mobilized for industrial warfare, moving with practiced efficiency through tasks that seemed choreographed by some invisible conductor. What struck him most profoundly was not the technology itself, which German engineers could have designed given sufficient resources, but the casual abundance of everything, the materials flowing into the facility without apparent constraint, the tools and equipment available to every worker, the systematic organization that treated complexity as a problem to be solved through method, rather than through exhortation or ideological fervor. This was not the frantic improvisation that had characterized German war production by 1944, not the desperate substitution of inferior materials and the constant battles against shortages, but something fundamentally different. Industrial capacity so vast that optimization rather than scarcity defined production decisions. The smell of aviation fuel, machine oil and freshly cut aluminum permeated the air with an industrial perfume that was both foreign and deeply unsettling. Hoffmann had served in the Luftwaffe ground crew from 1941 through his capture in France 2 months earlier, had spent 3 years maintaining aircraft that arrived in insufficient numbers and with chronic parts shortages, had watched the Reich's vaunted industrial capacity strain and fracture under the combined pressures of Allied bombing and raw material shortages that made even basic maintenance increasingly difficult. He understood aircraft production not as abstraction, but as lived reality, the desperate telegrams requesting parts that never arrived, the cannibalization of damaged aircraft to keep others flying, the gradual degradation of quality as experienced workers were drafted and replaced by increasingly inexperienced laborers, the sense of industrial systems slowly collapsing despite heroic efforts to maintain output. What he witnessed through that fence was the industrial negation of everything he had experienced. A production system operating at scales that made German aircraft manufacturing seem almost artisanal by comparison. The B-24s emerging from Willow Run's assembly line were not crude or hastily constructed despite their rapid production. They were precisely engineered machines with tolerances maintained through systematic quality control, with components interchangeable across aircraft, with manufacturing processes refined through continuous improvement, that treated production as a science to be optimized rather than as a challenge to be overcome through will and sacrifice. Each aircraft represented not just the labor of assembly, but the entire supply chain behind it. Aluminum smelted from bauxite, engines manufactured in separate facilities, instruments and avionics from specialized suppliers, all coordinated through logistics networks that functioned with reliability that German industry had never achieved even at its pre-war peak. In this moment, a German prisoner of war confronting the reality of American industrial capacity through direct observation of production lines whose output exceeded his capacity to rationalize within Nazi propaganda frameworks, represented a fundamental collision between ideology and material reality. For soldiers who had been taught that German technological and organizational superiority would overcome American materialism, that Aryan spirit would triumph over mongrel democracy, that quality would defeat quantity, the direct experience of American war production became an involuntary education in how industrial democracies could organize resources at scales that totalitarian command economies could not match despite theoretical advantages of centralized control and ideological unity. To understand the magnitude of this revelation, one must first comprehend the propaganda framework that had shaped German soldiers' understanding of American industrial capacity. Nazi ideology consistently portrayed America as a nation corrupted by capitalism and racial mixing, whose industrial output was inflated by Jewish-controlled media, whose weapons were inferior to German engineering, and whose workers lacked the discipline and commitment that characterized the German Volk. German military briefings emphasized American material advantages but dismissed them as irrelevant against superior German training, tactics, and equipment quality. The narrative was that Americans would produce many weapons of poor quality, while Germany produced fewer weapons of superior quality, and that in actual combat this qualitative superiority would prove decisive. Regardless of numerical disadvantages, Hoffman had believed these narratives because they aligned with his experience and because questioning them was both dangerous and psychologically difficult when the alternative was acknowledging that Germany might be fighting an unwinnable war. His service in the Luftwaffe had reinforced certain elements of the propaganda. German aircraft like the Bf-109 and Fw-190 were indeed exceptional machines when properly maintained. German pilots in 1941-42 had achieved kill ratios that suggested qualitative superiority, and the German military tradition of decentralized initiative and tactical flexibility had produced operational successes that seemed to validate claims about German military excellence. What the propaganda had not prepared him for was the possibility that American industry could produce both quantity and quality simultaneously, that mass production did not require sacrificing precision or capability, and that systematic organization of resources at continental scales could overcome the theoretical advantages of centralized control. The transfer to Willow Run had been part of a systematic American program to expose German POWs to American industrial capacity, a calculated exercise in psychological warfare designed to demoralize prisoners and prepare them for eventual repatriation to a defeated Germany by demonstrating the material hopelessness of continued resistance. American intelligence officers had recognized that many German soldiers retained faith in ultimate German victory despite military reversals, and that this faith often rested on fundamental misunderstandings about relative industrial capacity and America's ability to sustain war production while maintaining civilian prosperity. Direct observation of American factories, it was theorized, would shatter these illusions more effectively than any propaganda or interrogation could achieve. The program selected prisoners carefully, primarily mid-ranking, non-commissioned officers and junior officers with technical backgrounds who could understand what they were observing and who would likely survive to return to Germany and share their experiences. Hoffman's background in aircraft maintenance and his relatively low level of Nazi Party affiliation made him an ideal candidate. The Americans wanted witnesses who could comprehend the technical details of what they saw, who could compare American methods with German practices from direct experience, and who might be influenced by evidence that contradicted the ideological frameworks they had been given. The tour began with a lecture from a Ford Motor Company production manager, delivered through a German-speaking interpreter, explaining Willow Run's history and operating principles. The facility had been conceived in 1940 as part of Roosevelt's Arsenal of Democracy initiative, designed by Albert Kahn to accommodate the specific requirements of B-24 production, and began operations in 1942. Initial production had been slow as workers learned new skills and processes were refined. But by 1944, the plant was producing 1 bomber per hour at peak efficiency, a rate that would have seemed literally impossible to German aircraft manufacturers, whose best facilities produced perhaps 20 to 30 aircraft monthly, with similar workforce numbers. The manager explained this achievement matter-of-factly without boasting, treating extraordinary output as the natural result of systematic application of mass production principles that Ford had pioneered in automotive manufacturing and adapted to aircraft production. The sound of the assembly line became for Hoffman a symbol of American industrial philosophy, not a single machine, but an orchestrated system where each component arrived at precisely the right moment, where workers performed specialized tasks with tools designed specifically for those tasks, where the entire process flowed with rhythmic inevitability that reduced aircraft production to a series of repeatable, measurable, optimizable steps. This was the industrial embodiment of values that Nazi ideology had dismissed as soulless materialism. The treatment of production as engineering problem rather than as test of will. The standardization that allowed interchangeable parts and workers. The systematic documentation that enabled continuous improvement. The investment in specialized tooling that made each worker more productive. The coordination across multiple facilities and suppliers that required institutional trust and reliable communication. German aircraft production had never achieved this level of systematization despite attempts to rationalize manufacturing under Albert Speer's armaments ministry. German industry remained fragmented across multiple manufacturers with different standards, relied heavily on skilled craftsmen performing complex assembly tasks, and struggled with supply chain coordination that chronic shortages and Allied bombing continually disrupted. The theoretical advantages of German engineering excellence, precision, quality, attention to detail, became practical disadvantages when those virtues prevented mass production at scales required for industrial warfare. German aircraft were often superior to American equivalents when comparing individual examples, but American industry could produce 10 aircraft in the time Germany produced one, and in wars of attrition, quantity had its own quality. The tour proceeded through the facility with prisoners walking along catwalks that provided observation points over the main assembly floor. Hoffman watched aluminum sheets being formed into fuselage sections, watched wings being assembled from ribs and spars, watched engines being mounted to nacelles, watched electrical systems being installed with color-coded wiring that simplified troubleshooting and maintenance. Every process had been analyzed and optimized, with specialized tools and fixtures that enabled workers to complete complex tasks quickly and repeatably. The investment in tooling alone, the jigs, fixtures, templates, and specialized equipment, exceeded what entire German aircraft factories possessed, representing capital expenditure that German industry could not match given competing demands for resources and the disruption of bombing campaigns. But what struck Hoffman most profoundly was not the machinery, but the workers themselves and what their presence revealed about American society and values. The workforce included significant numbers of women, performing tasks that German culture would have considered inappropriate for female workers, operating complex machinery and performing precision assembly work with competence that challenged Nazi assumptions about proper gender roles and female capabilities. The workforce was racially diverse, including white, black, and other ethnic backgrounds working side by side, a visible refutation of Nazi racial ideology that had insisted racial mixing produced weakness and that certain races were inherently inferior. The workers appeared healthy and well-fed, moved with energy rather than exhaustion, and operated in facilities with safety, equipment, and work environments that suggested management concern for worker welfare rather than pure exploitation. The symbolism of the assembly line's sound, that continuous mechanical rhythm punctuated by the specific acoustics of riveting, welding, and component installation, took on deeper meaning as Hoffman began to understand what it represented about American industrial culture. This was production organized around efficiency rather than ideology, designed to maximize output through systematic method rather than through exhortation or sacrifice, enabled by investment in capital equipment that made each worker more productive rather than through intensification of labor or extension of hours. The sound was capitalism functioning at industrial scale, the audio signature of an economic system that could organize resources through market mechanisms and corporate structures in ways that produced both abundance and innovation without requiring the totalitarian control that Nazi ideology insisted was necessary for industrial efficiency. The contrast with German war production became more apparent as Hoffman reflected on his own experience. German aircraft factories by 1944 operated under constant stress. Material shortages required improvisation and substitution. Allied bombing disrupted production and destroyed tooling. Skilled workers were increasingly scarce as military demands depleted the labor force, and the entire system strained to maintain output despite cascading problems. German production had increased in absolute terms under Speer's rationalization, but the increases came through desperate measures, longer hours, worse working conditions, greater use of slave labor from concentration camps and occupied territories, and systematic sacrifice of quality for quantity that undermined the very advantages German equipment had supposedly possessed. The American system, visible at Willow Run, operated from opposite principles: abundance rather than scarcity, investment rather than exploitation, systematic optimization rather than crisis improvisation. The facility had been designed with excess capacity built in, had been supplied with tooling and equipment without apparent constraint, and operated with labor policies that suggested concern for maintaining workforce health and morale, rather than pure extraction of maximum effort. The institutional culture was one of continuous improvement through systematic analysis, where problems were solved through engineering and process refinement, rather than through demands for greater sacrifice and harder work. After the assembly line tour, prisoners were taken to a cafeteria where factory workers took their lunch breaks, and here Hoffman encountered another dimension of American industrial culture that challenged his understanding. The cafeteria served hot meals that included meat, vegetables, bread, and dessert, provided to workers at subsidized prices that made them affordable even for lower-wage employees. The food was not gourmet, but it was abundant and nutritious, served in quantities that seemed almost wasteful to someone who had experienced German wartime rationing since 1939. Workers ate casually, some leaving food uneaten, treating meals as routine entitlement, rather than precious resource to be carefully conserved. The symbolic object that crystallized Hoffman's transformation was not the food itself, but something more mundane: a white ceramic coffee cup, mass-produced and unremarkable, sitting on a cafeteria table. The cup represented industrial capacity extended to the smallest details of daily life, ceramic production at scales that made individual cups essentially disposable despite their durability, distribution systems that could provide them to cafeterias across the nation, and an industrial culture where even utilitarian objects reflected investment in quality and design that exceeded functional necessity. German equivalents would have been metal cups, likely showing wear and improvised repairs, treated as valuable resources rather than as routine items to be replaced when damaged. The American coffee cup announced a society with industrial depth that extended beyond military production into every aspect of material life, a civilization that could afford to produce millions of ceramic cups while simultaneously producing bombers at rates that exceeded Germany's entire aircraft industry. The prisoners were encouraged to ask questions through interpreters, and Hoffman found himself inquiring about how Willow Run's production was coordinated with suppliers, how quality control was maintained at such high production rates, how workers were trained, and how the facility adapted to design changes and improvements. The answers revealed systematic approaches to every aspect of production. Suppliers were coordinated through formal contracts and delivery schedules. Quality was maintained through statistical sampling and inspection at multiple production stages. Workers were trained through structured programs that broke complex tasks into learnable components, and design changes were implemented through engineering change orders that propagated through documentation systems, ensuring all affected parties were informed and updated. The bureaucratic sophistication underlying this industrial achievement was itself revelatory. Willow Run's output required coordination across hundreds of suppliers, management of tens of thousands of workers, integration of continuous design improvements, and systematic documentation that allowed problems to be identified and solved systematically. This required institutional capabilities that German industry possessed in theory, but that had been undermined by Nazi administrative chaos, by competing power centers within the regime, by Hitler's personal interventions in production decisions, and by the systematic destruction of competent bureaucracy in favor of ideologically reliable but often incompetent party loyalists. As the tour concluded and prisoners were returned to their camp, Hoffman sat in silence, processing what he had witnessed. The implications cascaded through his understanding of the war and of the ideological framework that had shaped his worldview. If America could produce bombers at such rates, could sustain such industrial operations while maintaining civilian prosperity, could organize resources at such scales through democratic institutions and capitalist economics, then everything he had been taught about American weakness and German superiority was fundamentally wrong. The war was not a test of will or spirit or racial quality, but a contest of industrial capacity and organizational competence. And in that contest, Germany had challenged an opponent whose advantages were so overwhelming that defeat had been inevitable once America entered the war and mobilized its economy. Other prisoners on the transport truck discussed what they had seen, their conversations mixing professional admiration for American industrial achievement with dawning recognition that Germany had lost the war not through military failures but through fundamental miscalculation about the nature of modern industrial warfare. Some prisoners remained in denial, suggesting that what they had seen was propaganda, or that Germany possessed secret weapons that would reverse the strategic situation. But most particularly those with technical backgrounds who could appreciate the significance of what Willow Run represented, acknowledged that they had witnessed evidence of American capabilities that exceeded German propaganda's most alarmist claims about enemy industrial strength. The sound of the assembly line persisted in Hoffman's memory, recurring in dreams and moments of reflection, becoming associated with the broader realization that he had devoted years of his life to a cause that had been doomed from the moment it challenged opponents, whose combined industrial capacity exceeded Germany's by orders of magnitude. The rhythmic industrial symphony had been the sound of his ideological certainty collapsing, of propaganda's lies being exposed by direct observation, of the future approaching with mechanical inevitability, as American factories produced weapons at rates that no amount of German tactical brilliance could overcome. In the months following the Willow Run visit, as news of Allied advances made clear that German defeat was imminent, Hoffmann's political transformation continued. He participated in camp education programs where American instructors provided information about democratic institutions, about free market economics, about the pluralistic society that had produced the industrial capacity he had witnessed. The instruction was explicitly designed to prepare prisoners for repatriation to a Germany that would be reformed along democratic lines, to undermine residual Nazi ideology, and to create cadre of Germans who understood from experience that democratic capitalism could produce both prosperity and military effectiveness without requiring the totalitarian control that Nazism had insisted was necessary. The white ceramic coffee cup became for Hoffmann a mental symbol, connecting the specific experience of Willow Run to broader truths about American society and the war's meaning. The cup represented industrial capacity that penetrated every aspect of life, values that treated quality and abundance as achievable for common citizens, rather than as luxuries reserved for elites, and institutional competence that could organize complex supply chains to provide routine items reliably across a continental nation. Each time he drank coffee in the camp mess hall using similar mass-produced cups, he was reminded that Germany had challenged a society whose industrial depth was visible in the smallest objects, whose organizational capabilities extended from ceramic dishware to bomber production, and whose values emphasized material abundance and individual welfare rather than collective sacrifice and martial virtue. Germany's surrender in May 1945 reached the POW camps through official announcements and through newspapers that provided detailed coverage of the Reich's total collapse. For Hoffmann and most prisoners, the news brought primarily relief that the killing had stopped, along with anxiety about what would become of Germany under occupation and what their own futures held. The war's end validated what the Willow Run visit had suggested, that Germany had been comprehensively defeated by coalition forces whose industrial capacity and military power exceeded German capabilities so thoroughly that continued resistance had been futile, that the final year of war had been a prolonged working out of a strategic conclusion that material logic had already determined. Repatriation began in late 1945 and continued through 1946, with prisoners being processed through security screenings designed to identify war criminals and assess political reliability. Hoffmann's repatriation came in spring 1946, and he returned to a Germany that had been shattered beyond recognition. Cities destroyed by bombing, infrastructure collapsed, economy in ruins, population traumatized and politically disoriented. But he carried with him lessons from his imprisonment that would influence his approach to reconstruction and to the democratic institutions that Allied occupation forces were establishing. In Western zones, the sound of industrial production, which had been omnipresent at Willow Run, was largely absent from post-war Germany's devastated industrial landscape. Factories had been bombed, machinery had been damaged or destroyed, supply chains had collapsed, and the organizational knowledge required for complex manufacturing had been disrupted by war's end. But as Reconstruction progressed and German industry began recovering under Marshall Plan assistance and Allied support, that industrial rhythm gradually returned, initially to textile factories and light manufacturing, eventually to automotive production and heavy industry, finally to the sophisticated manufacturing that would characterize West Germany's Wirtschaftswunder, economic miracle. Hoffmann found work in Germany's recovering automotive industry, applying skills learned in aircraft maintenance to civilian manufacturing, and he recognized in post-war German industrial development echoes of what he had observed at Willow Run. The systematic approaches to production, the investment in tooling and worker training, the emphasis on quality control and continuous improvement, the coordination of complex supply chains, all reflected lessons that German industry was learning from American and Allied practices, incorporating methods that had proven effective during the war into peacetime production. The coffee cups in German factories and cafeterias were initially crude and often improvised, but gradually they too became mass-produced. Ceramic ware that reflected recovering industrial capacity and rising living standards. The transformation in Hoffmann's political understanding from Nazi propagandas lies to recognition of democratic capitalism's practical advantages was shared by many German POWs who had experienced American industrial capacity firsthand. They became vectors for cultural and political change in post-war Germany, explaining to families and communities what they had learned about American society, challenging residual Nazi ideology with first-hand testimony about democratic institutions' effectiveness, and contributing to broader German acceptance of Western democratic values and market economics. Their influence was informal and difficult to measure precisely, but it contributed to the relatively successful democratic reconstruction of West Germany and to the rejection of extremist ideologies that Allied occupation authorities and German democratic reformers were working to achieve. The white ceramic coffee cup, which had seemed like a trivial detail during the Willow Run tour, became in Hoffmann's post-war reflection a symbol of the profound differences between the societies that had fought World War II. The cup represented the democratic industrial society's emphasis on abundance and quality of life, the extension of prosperity beyond elites to include common workers, the industrial capacity that could provide both military strength and civilian welfare simultaneously, and the values that measured success through material well-being, rather than through sacrifice and martial glory. Nazi Germany had demanded sacrifice from its people, while providing shortages and privation, had promised victory through will and spirit while its industrial base crumbled under strategic pressures it could not overcome, had insisted that totalitarian control was necessary for national greatness while demonstrating that such control actually undermined the institutional competencies required for modern industrial competition. In the broader context of World War II and its aftermath, the experiences of prisoners like Hoffmann, who witnessed American industrial capacity firsthand, contributed to Allied victory's psychological dimensions and to the post-war Reconstruction's ideological foundations. The physical destruction of German military forces was necessary but insufficient for achieving lasting peace and stability. Germans also needed to understand why they had lost, why the ideology that had led them into war had been fundamentally flawed, and why adopting different political and economic systems would serve their interests better than attempting to resurrect or modify defeated ideologies. Direct observation of American industrial strength, provided through carefully managed POW tours and supplemented with educational programs, helped achieve this psychological transformation more effectively than purely coercive occupation could have accomplished. The sound of Willow Run's assembly line, that continuous mechanical rhythm of bomber production at rates that violated German assumptions about industrial possibility, echoed through post-war decades as a symbol of American industrial supremacy and of the lessons German defeat had taught. The sound represented more than just manufacturing efficiency. It represented the practical advantages of democratic organization, market economics, and institutional cultures that valued systematic method over ideological fervor. It was the audio signature of modernity, triumphing over traditionalism, of industrial abundance defeating martial virtue, and of pluralistic society, demonstrating that diversity and freedom were sources of strength rather than weakness. When German POWs were shocked by the endless production lines powering the U.S. Army, they discovered that wars of industrial attrition were won by nations whose economic and organizational foundations could sustain material production at scales that transformed quantity into its own quality. They learned that Nazi ideology had fundamentally misunderstood modern warfare's nature, that racial theories and martial spirit could not overcome systematic disadvantages in productive capacity, and that the democratic capitalism they had been taught to despise was actually more effective than totalitarian alternatives at organizing resources for both war and peace. These lessons, carried home by hundreds of thousands of prisoners and shared with German society during Reconstruction, became part of the foundation for West Germany's democratic transformation and its eventual emergence as a prosperous, stable democratic state integrated into the Western Alliance. The white ceramic coffee cup sitting on a Willow Run cafeteria table, mass-produced, unremarkable, casually discarded when damaged, had communicated truths about American industrial civilization that no propaganda could have conveyed as effectively. It testified to productive systems that created abundance rather than managing scarcity, to values that measured progress through rising living standards rather than through conquest and glory, and to institutional competencies that made complexity manageable rather than overwhelming. That cup, and the industrial symphony of the bomber assembly line it was connected to, represented the material foundations of American power and the practical superiority of democratic industrial organization over totalitarian alternatives, lessons that Hoffman and countless other German prisoners learned through direct observation and carried forward into a reconstructed Germany that would build its renewed prosperity on foundations quite different from those that had led to catastrophe and defeat.